I've been to a boarding school, and there was the first time I experienced a real crisis in my own well-being. I've gone out and explored and asked questions. Is there a hidden well-being crisis in boarding schools?
One of my specialities is something I've been working on since 1989, and trying to find out what actually goes on for a boarding school child when they are abandoned by their parents in this very, very privileged environment. And they are very privileged places, there is no doubt about that. It costs a fortune, they've got great facilities, small classes, etc., etc. A serious psychological overview of it hadn't been made, so the first thing I did was go through all the literature to see what anyone else had spoken about it. And all you get really is throwaway remarks from someone like John Bowlby, who's the founder of attachment theory, who said he wouldn't send a dog to boarding school, he was a boarder himself.
I came here when I was 13. I remember, this was the place where I really started to be creative. But I remember, I guess most of all, I remember being alone quite a lot.
My earlier time at prep school, I think boarding had a novelty to it. It was exciting. It was a sense of community. It was quite small and inclusive. Eton was a more mixed bag, it was a much bigger pond. It was a more noticeably competitive environment. The entire 5 years there was challenging, and I coped with that in various different ways.
So I went to a boarding school in Wiltshire when I was 13. I stayed there much longer than I should have, until at the end it was like, I can't do this anymore. And it was breaking point. I waited until breaking point just because for me it was the choice to go to boarding school. The whole time I never had a good time there, ever. But I constantly was kind of like, it was my decision to come here. And I felt really bad for them to just say like, I want to quit. Of course, the thing that you choose when you're 13 years old is not going to be the thing that you need when you're 18.
It's a really, really stressful time to be a kid at an all male school that's like so hyper competitive, and you don't have your parents around. You become like emotionally quite stunted, and that's sad.
It's like I wasn't allowed to like feel the world. I was like, it was just given to me on a plate, and it's like, I know that's not what it is.
You're removed from your parents, and you develop abandonment issues, and I developed abandonment issues, and that kind of snowballed into feelings of being rejected by my parents.
So there's a tremendous amount of loss that the child has to endure. Now the question is, when does that come out in the person?
There's a lot of kind of clouded memories, a lot of like smells and like walking the same routes, like memories, they come back. That smell, that's the carpets, it's like testosterone and mud and like shin pad sweat. And over the years I kind of started to see it more from like a positive light. I used to be very angry at the like experience, which made those memories become even more kind of blocked.
I'm going to be away from home. I want something that's like home. I just didn't realize that's not what I needed, and that's not home at all.
The press come to me and they're terribly challenging about this. So they say, oh, Mr. Duffel, so you say everyone is scarred for life for boarding. No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying every child has to survive it. And they do it all actually in different ways. But one of the first ways that most children do it is they cut their feelings off. So they don't become emotionally intelligent, they don't become emotionally literate. You don't know what you're feeling sometimes. And there's a cost to that. And there's a cost to that as individuals, there's a cost to that as a nation. And so when I wrote my second book, Wounded Leaders, that was all about what's the cost of having emotionally illiterate people run our country, people who specifically had to disown their vulnerability. Is it the case that they are now not able to understand the vulnerability of others?
there's still a feeling in boarding schools that to be emotional is to be weak, to be emotional is to be is a woman's thing, and beneath that is a fear of being emotional, because being emotional is scary. I learned that mechanism of just being okay all the time, being good at things, and I then found that led me to fall flat on my face at about 20, a couple of years after leaving, and then had to learn terrifyingly how to be publicly, emotionally vulnerable, real, raw, and it was terrifying, and something that boarding school didn't equip me for at all.
I remember feeling very confused a lot of the time, not really being able to ask questions or go against the culture of this place.
There's like this whole little structure, and then all the boys have to come out exactly fitting into that, you know what I mean?
There's constantly a feeling of competing, basically, which means that there's not very much scope at all for not knowing, for not being sure, for not knowing how to cope, for being vulnerable, for being scared, for being anything that's not perceived as certain, secure, safe, successful. And so there's a lot of face saving, there's a lot of mask wearing.
It's a problem then also having the expectations you're going to succeed and love it, because it costs your parents a lot of money, which gives a sort of internal shaming.
I remember feeling kind of residual sense of pressure because boarding school is expensive. You know, my education wasn't mine; it was owned, and I was in debt and had to repay that. And the system of repaying that is by making a success of it, and therefore working really hard, doing really well in exams, going into all the sports teams, being in the school play, and there's a definite feeling of you've got this opportunity, don't waste it. I definitely had sort of burnout from that.
When journalists come to ask me, they say, well, I'm going to go to this boarding school and have a look, and I say, you will not see many unhappy children, and the reason is because they've all got their happy masks on.
You had to get on, you had to, you had exams coming up, and you had the stuff you had to do, and you had the sports team to be in, and you had, it was like, keep going, keep going, keep going, don't look back. There's a lot of that at this school. Don't look back so much until you never realize that you're just repeating the past, you're just repeating. And if you do send your kids to boarding school, like, be aware and curious, and ask your child how they're doing, and I think it's easy to assume that your child is doing okay or having a good time because of these activities that they make you do, and that's kind of a smokescreen a little bit sometimes.
And then there's a difference between girls and boys. You see, when in girls' boarding schools, you might see more problems than in boys' schools, because girls have a tendency to, what we call in our profession, to somatize the problem. So it comes out in a physical thing like eating habits. So they show their distress in a physical way, but not actually perhaps what the cause of the distress is, whereas the boys tend to cut it off a bit more thoroughly, and then it sort of pops up, smacks them in the face later.
That had certainly been my experience. I recently came across these photos and posters that I used to have up on my wall when I was a boarder. I considered it inspirational at the time, and it definitely led to unhealthy eating habits and intense exercise routines. This is an experience shared by many girls at boarding schools.
I know after I came out, I was really frustrated at the fact that, there was so many writings and art around me that could have helped me at that point, but nobody was providing it to me.
You're away a lot, so a lot of the time I'm just not really thinking about my family.
My parents didn't really get to know me because these years are the years where you're growing the most emotionally and physically, and to not be there as a parent, you lose out a lot. And I know that was kind of them trying to be the best parents, give me the best education that I could. But I guess it's just that we have totally different ideas of what education is. I think if you spend half the amount of money and twice the amount of time with your kids, both you and them benefit from it.
So I think that the answer, which lies in a wholesale shift in what we perceive education to be. I would like to see a normalised environment in boarding schools where it was an acceptable and even encouraged part of the culture to be able to be vulnerable, to question, to doubt. And it's 1,000 teenagers, no one's sure of themselves.
On a national level, I think we've got to stop early boarding. That's the main thing. I think if you look at it through developmental psychology, when are children ready to do without their parents for significant amounts of times, it's not when you're 8, it's not when you're 13, it really isn't. It's not when you're going through puberty, although sometimes you think you don't need your parents through puberty, but you do. You really do. So I'd say, what about closing down early boarding, using all the schools that you closed down as sixth form colleges for doing more boarding, say from the age of 16, more democratic, not so based on parental income, and you actually use them in a way of getting, there's a lot of teenagers could do with getting off the streets now at 16. And then you're just about ready to do a bit of away from home and back again. But if you start sending kids away very, very early, they emotionally never come home. That's the risk.
There is a crisis of empathy and just emotional stuntedness at these places that extends and affects our entire social structure, because you have people leading our country who have been trained to dissociate with the child in them.
What we've got in Britain is we've got a society that has these boarding schools and normalises it, and you've got families who send their children to these schools. But actually, it's not normal that you send your children away. And so we've got actually a transgenerational problem where parents normalise boarding schools and lose the ability to parent properly, actually, especially if they're boarding school survivors themselves. And so we practice a kind of apartheid. We are like educating for division. And we've so normalised it that we don't really see it. I believe that politically and economically and everything, it keeps us very stuck.
This is tied, or at least this school is tied so much to the way that the socio-political structure is run in the UK.
Once I got into this, I realised that there was something going on in Britain which bothered me about Britain altogether. I've lived all over the world, and I always wondered what makes us so odd and so different from everybody else. And this is it. It all comes from this. It all comes from this, actually. I'm certain of it.